I'd like to welcome everyone to Salado United Methodist Church. This is the lectionary Bible study, and for a few more weeks, we're going to switch off and use the Abingdon Adult Bible Study lectionary that they make the daily Bible study out of, the mature years out of, and in this particular one, we're doing the Adult Bible Study teacher guide texts, and many Methodist churches use this material, so that's where our lessons come from. And then about in the middle of November, we will be back to the Revised Common Lectionary. I want to catch us up with where we're going to be when I talk about the exact text on Friday and beyond, or actually on Friday we will talk about Mark 16, 1 through 8. But today, Big Tuesday, I want to set the context between where we were when we last stopped Mark and where I'm going to pick up on Mark 16, 1. The last thing that happened in the Markan story of Jesus happened when Jesus says, "Get up, let's get going, my betrayer is at hand," or "Look, here comes my betrayer," as it says in the Common English Bible. So Jesus and the disciples have come to an end of their relationship together. It's at this point in Mark's story that Jesus is separated from the disciples by first the religious authorities and also the political authorities. They take Jesus away from them. So at this point in the story, Jesus has no more human contact with his disciples. And in Mark, he has no more at all. Now, in the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, Jesus will make what are called post-resurrection appearances. But as you will find out later in the week when we get to Mark 16, 1 through 8, it doesn't end up that way in Mark's gospel. Mark's ending is what we could call a big surprise. And so Jesus, while he is speaking to the disciples at this very end, Judas appears. For this whole time after Judas excused himself from the Passover Seder meal and left, for Judas, he is going to make this special deal for, he got some money from the authorities, and he comes, and the way that he identifies for the authorities which one the authorities should arrest, he gives Jesus a kiss on the cheek. And so we could call this the kiss of death, I suppose. And it's the way that Judas betrays him by a kiss of all things. And so Jesus is arrested. He's taken to the Sanhedrin, which is meeting. And what they do before this council, Jesus is questioned, he's mocked, he's, you could even say he was interrogated, and in all of these things, Jesus is pretty much humiliated and really says very little. But finally, in this story that Mark tells, and you know Mark likes this sandwiching technique between being interrogated by the Sanhedrin and the Jewish religious authorities. We have this picture of Peter, and he is in a courtyard below the building where Jesus is being questioned, and he has his opportunity. And people say to Peter, "Aren't you one of those who was with this Messiah Jesus?" And some people understand Jesus as a zealot. Some understand him as a prophet. Some understand him as a Messiah or even a false Messiah. They all have different ideas about Jesus. And the way Mark tells the story, this becomes important because earlier in chapter 8, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And then they make various guesses and so forth. Well, all of the population in Jerusalem at this point are people who are speculating about who Jesus is. And Peter, as had been forecast by Jesus earlier, denies Jesus each time. Now, the rest of the disciples have just scattered to the four winds. Nobody really knows what happened to any of them. And Mark drills down on Peter, and he shows us that Peter follows Jesus to the Sanhedrin where he's being questioned, but he stays outside, and there's a stove there for people to keep warm in the evenings and so forth. And finally, Jesus, as you remember, said, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter remembered that, and then he broke down weeping. This business of Jesus being interrogated, of course, is an all-night affair. After the religious authorities get done with Jesus, they bind him and send him to Pilate, who is the governor of Judea, or the Roman authority or governor of Palestine. And so he's a very important one. And so Pilate interrogates Jesus, and what's amusing or befuddling to Pilate, it kind of depends on how you read various translations of the text, is that he is mystified that Jesus says so little in Jesus' own defense. In other words, Pilate asks him questions and Jesus really doesn't say much at all, and Pilate is just amazed that Jesus doesn't try to defend himself or make excuses or whatever. And then at a certain point where Pilate is ready to just give up, he goes out to the crowds, the Passover crowds that have gathered, and it is his custom that every year at the Passover, he will offer to the crowd the release of one of the prisoners. And so Pilate is hoping, because he finds nothing wrong with Jesus and that it's just out of pure jealousy that he's brought up on charges in the first place, Pilate decides to offer Jesus to the crowd. But the crowd wants nothing to do with Jesus. What they want is Barabbas to be released to them. And Barabbas, as you read from a sort of compilation of the four Gospels where Barabbas occurs, he's just kind of a common criminal. And there's a fascinating book by a Swedish author called Per Lagerkvist, and he has written a book called Barabbas, and it's a fascinating read. Well, Pilate decides, since he releases Barabbas, that there's nothing else to do except for prepare Jesus to be crucified. And so he calls his soldiers and has Jesus carried away. And this is, he's carried away from the governor's quarters, and he is eventually taken to Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. On the way, the soldiers mock Jesus, and Jesus, at this point, after the ordeal of being beaten and tortured all night long, questioned all night long, probably standing for the better part of 12 or more hours, is just too completely weak and exhausted to carry his own cross. And so the Romans press into service this fella named Simon of Cyrene, and he carries Jesus' cross for him. Um, and so they go to the place of the skull, Golgotha, and the soldiers, as Jesus is on the cross, they cast lots for his clothing, which couldn't have been worth very much. But the casting of lots in the Bible is something that is done from time to time. I suppose it's a little bit like our flipping a coin or doing rock, paper, or scissors to make a decision about some random thing or another. And so they gamble for Jesus' clothing. And what's interesting to me is that all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all mention Jesus' clothing being gambled for. And of course, this comes from a quotation in Psalm 22 about casting lots for someone's clothing. And it's interesting to me because generally speaking, all four Gospels don't line up on a same minuscule point like they do on this one. And so most scholars think that this is taking a quote from Psalm 22 and turning it into a fulfilled prophecy, which it well may be. Two things happen when Jesus dies, according to Mark. The first thing is the curtain of the temple is torn in two. It's rent asunder, as they say. And one of the reasons that Mark writes this into his gospel is because, like the fig tree, the temple is doomed. Jesus says it's bankrupt and bereft of all the things that it was slated to do, which were to lead the nation in prayer, lead the nation in worship. And now it's become, as Jesus himself said, a den of thieves and robbers. And so when the temple curtain is torn in two, and it was a seamless curtain, and so the tearing of it from top to bottom would have been extremely difficult to do, the kind of thing that suggests that God rent the temple curtain in half. The other thing that it does is it reminds us about what happens when Jesus was baptized. The heavens were torn open, and one could hear the voice of God and see the descent of the Spirit. The second thing that happens when Jesus dies, and this is something to note about the uniqueness of Mark's gospel, Mark thinks almost all human beings are just pretty much wannabe disciples. They are willing to make these courageous professions of loyalty, and their actions don't match them at all. And what happens when Jesus dies is a Roman centurion, a Gentile, says, surely this is the Son of God. And so in the entire 16 chapters of Mark's gospel, there's one person who actually recognizes who Jesus is, and he perhaps recognizes this by the way that Jesus dies, and he is the one that makes the confession of faith, surely this is the Son of God. It's ironic in Mark's way of doing things to talk about this in this way, that it would be a Gentile soldier, probably an Italian, from a foreign country that had nothing to do with Judaism at all, that he is the one who recognizes Jesus as the Messiah of God. And so the last thing that I want to say is that if you have a Bible and you look at it very closely, one of the things that you will notice is that there are 3 endings to the Gospel of Mark, which is kind of weird. The Gospel of Mark, most authorities and most ancient manuscripts ended at chapter 16, verse 8. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now we'll talk about that particular verse the next time we get together. But I want you to know that that is the legitimate, as far as most scholars believe, the legitimate ending of Mark. But that ending is so painful for the early church that they said, surely we lost part of Mark's gospel manuscript. Mark wouldn't have the end of the gospel saying that the women who had appeared up to that particular verse to be so faithful and true to Jesus, then all of a sudden would run away from the tomb in terror. But that is Mark's point of the gospel, is that one cannot count on human beings, whether they're the disciples who Jesus has summoned by Lake Galilee and been with for 3 years, or whether they're women who are very faithful, who come to the tomb early in the morning on Easter morning to anoint the body. No matter who it is, what kind of human being it is, human beings are not to be trusted, which means that our trust as human beings can only be placed in God. And so people thought that ending, chapter 16, verse 8, is too raw. So then there's what is called the shorter ending to Mark, and it tells some things, and it's usually printed in most of our Bibles. And then there is a longer ending of Mark, which is quite a few verses. It's about another 12 or 13 verses, which sort of wraps up Mark's story in a way that's a little bit more palatable. Let me give you an analogy, and then we'll be done for today. In the gospel, we have this particular ending because Mark's authentic ending, as we believe, is just too raw. Well, there's another book in the Bible that sometimes scholars speculate that the same thing could have happened. In the book of Job, we have basically about 40 or 41 chapters that talk about the pain of Job, the anger of Job, the questions of Job, and then some of God's questions back to Job, which are not really answers to Job's questions, but they probe Job's questions with even more questions. And then at the very end of the book of Job, we have sort of a fairy tale like ending where Job gets everything back in spades, and he lives happily ever after, essentially. And people have said that the end of the book of Job is so raw that some editors or priests or religious authorities in the time of Job during perhaps the exile in Babylon, they said, we can't leave Job this way, bleeding and dying and raising his fist to God and all that business. We need something like a happier ending. And so they put this ending in the book of Job where Job gets everything back in spades and he goes on happily ever after. The truth of the matter is we don't know exactly what happened, but that last half of the last chapter of Job 42 is so counterintuitive to the rest of the book of Job that many scholars believe somebody has come back and tried to fix the text to give it a cheerier, happier ending. Well, the next time we get together, which will be at the end of the week, we will take a look at these verses here from Mark 16, 1 through 8. If you want to take a look at those texts and kind of do your homework and be ready to go, I will see you in a few days. So thank you very much for being a part of our study today at Salado United Methodist Church.